March 15th, 1945. Prisoner of war camp, Fort Meade, Maryland. Dr. Klaus Werner, formerly Oberstarzt of the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, sat in the camp's medical facility watching American doctors treat wounded German prisoners who had arrived from European battlefields just 48 hours earlier. What he witnessed contradicted everything he understood about battlefield medicine and the logistics of medical evacuation. "This is not possible," he muttered to his fellow prisoner, Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, also a Wehrmacht surgeon. "These men were wounded in Germany 3 days ago. Now they are in America receiving surgical care. The transportation alone should have killed them. The infection risk from such a long journey without proper medical facilities should be catastrophic. Yet they arrive in stable condition, most of them conscious and responsive." Dr. Hartmann nodded, equally bewildered. "I treated soldiers on the Eastern Front who died from infected wounds because we couldn't evacuate them to proper hospitals for weeks. Transportation was too dangerous, too slow, too unreliable. We lost more men to infection and complications than to the original wounds. But the Americans move wounded soldiers across an ocean in less time than we could move them 200 kilometers to a field hospital." Werner watched as American medical staff worked with practiced efficiency. Wounded German prisoners received blood transfusions, antibiotics, pain medication, and prepared for surgery within hours of arrival. The facility had modern equipment, ample supplies, trained specialists, and a calm, organized atmosphere that bore no resemblance to the desperate, overwhelmed German field hospitals Werner had worked in for 4 years. "How?" Werner asked one of the American doctors, Captain Robert Morrison. "How do you move wounded men from European battlefields to American hospitals in days? How do they survive such journeys? How do you have sufficient medical supplies, blood, antibiotics, surgical capacity to treat thousands of casualties while also fighting a war?" Captain Morrison smiled, recognizing a fellow medical professional's genuine curiosity. "It's called the chain of evacuation, Doctor. We don't just move wounded soldiers. We treat them continuously from the moment they're hit until they reach definitive surgical care. Every link in the chain provides a higher level of medical care. Battlefield medics stabilize wounds within minutes. Battalion aid stations provide initial treatment within an hour. Field hospitals perform emergency surgery within 6 hours. Air evacuation moves critical patients to rear area hospitals within 24 hours. Hospital ships and air transport bring them to the United States within days. At every stage, they receive treatment that keeps them alive until the next stage can provide better care." Werner shook his head in disbelief. The logistics required for such a system must be enormous. The training, the supplies, the transportation, the coordination across thousands of miles. This is not battlefield medicine as we understand it. This is industrial medicine. Medicine at a scale that treats wounded soldiers like products on an assembly line, moving them through stages of increasing care with the efficiency of a factory. Captain Morrison's smile faded slightly. "That's exactly what it is, Doctor. And it works. Our survival rate for wounded soldiers who reach medical care is over 96%. We save men who would have died in any previous war. The system isn't cheap, it isn't simple, and it requires massive logistical support, but it saves lives, thousands of lives. And that's what matters. What Dr. Klaus Werner didn't yet understand, what German medical professionals throughout the Wehrmacht were only beginning to grasp in the war's final months, was that American military medicine wasn't just better than German medicine. It operated in an entirely different paradigm, one where logistics, technology, and industrial capacity had transformed battlefield medicine from a desperate attempt to save the savable into a comprehensive system that could treat nearly any wound if the soldier reached medical care alive. The chain of evacuation that seemed impossible to German doctors was already operational, already saving lives at rates that defied pre-war medical expectations, and already proving that American military medicine had revolutionized casualty care in ways that would permanently change how wars were fought. To understand why German medical professionals found American battlefield medicine so shocking, we must first examine the state of military medical care in World War II and the seemingly insurmountable challenges of treating combat casualties under battlefield conditions. Traditional military medicine before World War II operated on principles established during World War I and refined only marginally in the interwar period. The basic system involved several stages. Combat medics, called corpsmen by the Navy and Marines, would provide first aid on the battlefield, applying bandages, administering morphine for pain, and evacuating wounded to collection points. From these collection points, wounded soldiers would be transported to battalion aid stations, located a few hundred yards behind the front lines, where doctors could perform basic treatment, triage casualties, and determine who needed evacuation to field hospitals. Field hospitals, typically located several miles behind the lines, had surgical capacity but limited equipment and staff. They performed emergency operations to save lives, but couldn't provide definitive treatment for serious wounds. Soldiers requiring extended care would be evacuated to base hospitals in rear areas, often hundreds of miles from the front. This evacuation might take days or weeks, depending on transportation, availability, and tactical situations. Many soldiers died during these evacuations from wound infections, blood loss, or complications that couldn't be treated in transit. The fundamental problems were time, transportation, and medical capacity. Time. The longer a wounded soldier went without definitive medical care, the more likely he was to die from infection, shock, or complications. Transportation. Moving wounded soldiers was difficult, dangerous, and slow, especially near combat zones. Medical capacity. Even when soldiers reached hospitals, those hospitals often lacked sufficient staff, equipment, or supplies to treat large numbers of casualties. World War I casualty statistics illustrated these limitations starkly. Approximately 8% of American soldiers wounded in World War I died of their wounds, a significant improvement over 19th century wars but still representing thousands of preventable deaths from infections, blood loss, and shock that modern medicine should have been able to prevent. The problem wasn't medical knowledge. Doctors understood how to treat wounds. The problem was logistics, getting wounded soldiers to capable doctors quickly enough to save them. German military medicine in World War II operated within these same constraints, compounded by Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. German battlefield medics were well trained and capable. German military doctors were competent professionals. German field hospitals could perform complex surgery when supplies were available, but the Wehrmacht medical system struggled with chronic shortages of supplies, transportation difficulties, and overwhelming casualty volumes that exceeded available medical capacity. On the Eastern Front, where German forces fought the Soviet Union across vast distances in terrible weather, medical evacuation was particularly nightmarish. Wounded soldiers might wait days for transport to field hospitals. Those hospitals, when soldiers reached them, often lacked antibiotics, blood for transfusions, or surgical supplies. Infections were common and frequently fatal. Gangrene, blood poisoning, and shock killed soldiers whose wounds should have been survivable with proper medical care. Dr. Klaus Werner, before his capture in March 1945, had served 2 years on the Eastern Front. His experience there shaped his understanding of battlefield medicine's limitations. In a post-war interview, he described conditions. "We received wounded soldiers days after they were injured. By then, infection had set in. We had limited antibiotics, no blood bank for transfusions, insufficient surgical equipment. We did what we could, but we lost many men who should have survived. The wounds themselves weren't necessarily fatal. The time between injury and treatment, the lack of supplies, the impossible patient loads, these factors killed soldiers. I performed amputations without anesthesia because we had none. I cleaned infected wounds with boiled water because we had no antiseptics. I watched soldiers die from blood loss because we couldn't transfuse them. These deaths weren't failures of medical knowledge. They were failures of logistics. We knew how to save these men. We simply lacked the resources and systems to do so." This experience was typical for Wehrmacht medical personnel throughout the war. German military doctrine recognized the importance of rapid medical care, but German industrial capacity and logistical systems couldn't provide the resources necessary to implement that doctrine effectively. As the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated, medical supplies became scarcer, transportation less reliable, and casualty volumes more overwhelming. American military medicine evolved very differently, driven by different strategic priorities and supported by vastly superior industrial capacity. American military planners in 1941 and 1942 studied World War I casualty rates and concluded that unacceptable numbers of soldiers were dying from wounds that should be survivable. They set an ambitious goal: reduce the mortality rate for wounded soldiers who reached medical care to below 4%, half the World War I rate. Achieving this goal required fundamental changes to military medicine. Simply having better doctors or more hospitals wouldn't suffice. The entire system needed redesign, from the moment a soldier was wounded until his return to duty or evacuation home. Every stage of medical care needed integration into a comprehensive chain, where each link provided increasingly sophisticated treatment while maintaining continuous care throughout the evacuation process. The solution was the medical chain of evacuation, a system that treated battlefield medicine as a logistics problem as much as a medical problem. The chain consisted of multiple stages, each providing a specific level of care and smoothly transitioning patients to the next stage when they required more sophisticated treatment. The first stage was battlefield first aid provided by combat medics. American medics received extensive training far exceeding previous wars. They learned not just to apply bandages, but to manage shock, control severe bleeding, perform basic triage, and administer appropriate medications. Each infantry company had multiple medics, ensuring wounded soldiers received care within minutes of being hit. Medics carried comprehensive medical kits, including morphine for pain, sulfur powder for infection prevention, bandages, and plasma for fluid replacement. The second stage was battalion aid stations located just behind the front lines, typically 200 to 500 yards from combat positions. These stations, staffed by doctors and medics, provided immediate stabilizing care. Doctors could stop hemorrhaging, treat shock with plasma transfusions, perform minor surgery, and prepare casualties for evacuation. Aid stations maintained radio communication with forward medical units, allowing them to request ambulances or air evacuation for critical casualties. The third stage was collecting stations where casualties from multiple aid stations were gathered, further treated and triaged. Medical personnel assessed which casualties needed immediate surgery versus which could be evacuated to rear hospitals. This triage ensured that limited surgical capacity was used efficiently. The fourth stage was field hospitals, mobile surgical units located a few miles behind the lines. These hospitals could perform complex emergency surgery, including abdominal operations, amputations, chest surgery, and treatment of severe wounds. Field hospitals operated close enough to the front that critical casualties could reach them within hours of being wounded, early enough to prevent infection and shock from becoming fatal. The fifth stage was evacuation hospitals in secure rear areas, typically 20 to 50 miles behind the lines. These facilities had greater surgical capacity, more specialized staff, and better equipment than field hospitals. Casualties requiring extended treatment or specialized care were evacuated here after initial stabilization at field hospitals. The sixth stage was base hospitals, far from combat zones, often in different countries or continents. These facilities provided definitive treatment for severe casualties, long-term care, rehabilitation, and return-to-duty processing for recovered soldiers. Each stage of this chain was designed to move casualties toward more sophisticated care as quickly as possible, while providing continuous treatment throughout the journey. The key innovation was that medical care never stopped. A wounded soldier wasn't just transported from one facility to another, he was treated continuously, with each link in the chain building on the previous link's work to prevent deterioration and maximize survival chances. But the chain was only as strong as its transportation links. Moving thousands of wounded soldiers through multiple stages required transportation capacity on a scale previously unimaginable. The American military addressed this through dedicated medical vehicles, hospital trains, hospital ships, and most revolutionary, air evacuation. Medical vehicles, specially equipped ambulances, and trucks with medical supplies and space for litters moved casualties from aid stations to field hospitals. These weren't simple trucks with wounded soldiers piled in the back. They were mobile medical units where personnel could monitor patients, administer treatment, and respond to complications during transit. Hospital trains, converted rail cars equipped as mobile hospitals, moved large numbers of casualties from field hospitals to evacuation hospitals. These trains had surgical facilities, operating rooms, pharmacy services, and medical staff who provided care during multi-day journeys. Hospital ships, converted civilian vessels or purpose-built medical ships, evacuated casualties across oceans from European and Pacific theaters to American hospitals. These floating hospitals had full surgical capacity, could treat hundreds of patients simultaneously, and maintained continuous medical care during week-long voyages. The ships were marked with large red crosses, theoretically protecting them under Geneva Conventions, though some were attacked by submarines despite these markings. Air evacuation was the revolution that made the entire system possible. Transport aircraft, primarily Douglas C-47 seconds converted for medical use, could move critical casualties from field hospitals to evacuation hospitals in hours rather than days. By 1944, air evacuation was moving thousands of casualties weekly from European and Pacific combat zones to rear area hospitals, dramatically reducing the time between wounding and definitive surgery. This transportation network required vast resources. The medical department operated thousands of ambulances, hundreds of hospital trains, dozens of hospital ships, and hundreds of air evacuation aircraft. Maintaining this fleet, providing fuel, spare parts, and crews, represented a massive logistical undertaking that only American industrial capacity could sustain. The medical supplies required to support this system were equally staggering. American military medicine operated on the principle that supply should never be the limiting factor in saving lives. If a treatment existed that might save a soldier, the supplies for that treatment should be available at the appropriate stage of the evacuation chain. This meant producing and distributing enormous quantities of medications, surgical supplies, blood products, and medical equipment. Penicillin, the revolutionary antibiotic discovered in 1928 but not mass-produced until World War II, exemplified this approach. American pharmaceutical companies, supported by government contracts, produced penicillin in quantities that seemed impossible to German and British observers. By 1943, American military forces had sufficient penicillin to treat every wounded soldier who needed antibiotics. By 1944, production had increased to the point where penicillin was available not just for military casualties, but for civilian use as well. The impact on survival rates was dramatic. Infected wounds, which had been the primary killer of wounded soldiers in World War I, became manageable. Soldiers who would have died from gangrene or blood poisoning in previous wars survived because medics applied sulfur powder to wounds within minutes and doctors administered penicillin within hours. The mortality rate from infected wounds dropped from approximately 18% in World War I to less than 1% by 1944. Blood transfusions, critical for treating shock and blood loss, required blood banking systems that could collect, store, and distribute blood to battlefield medical units. The American Red Cross established a national blood donation program that collected millions of units of blood. This blood was processed, preserved with anticoagulants, and shipped to combat theaters where it was stored in refrigerated facilities near field hospitals. When casualties arrived needing transfusions, compatible blood was available within minutes. The logistics of this blood supply system were extraordinary. Blood had to be collected in the United States, processed, preserved, shipped across oceans, distributed to medical units, stored properly, and used before expiration. Each step required coordination, refrigeration, transportation, and quality control. German military medicine couldn't replicate this system because Germany lacked the refrigeration capacity, the transportation infrastructure, and the industrial base to collect and distribute blood at this scale. Plasma, the liquid component of blood without cells, could be freeze-dried into powder form, dramatically extending its shelf life and eliminating refrigeration requirements. American pharmaceutical companies produced dried plasma in vast quantities. Combat medics carried plasma in their medical kits and could reconstitute it with sterile water to provide fluid replacement for soldiers in shock. This immediate treatment at the point of injury saved countless lives by preventing soldiers from dying of shock before reaching surgical care. The training required to staff this medical system was similarly massive. The United States trained over 700,000 medical personnel during World War II, including doctors, nurses, medics, corpsmen, and medical technicians. Training emphasized not just medical skills but also the procedures for operating within the evacuation chain. Medical personnel learned to stabilize patients for evacuation, to document treatment provided at each stage, and to coordinate with transportation units to ensure smooth handoffs between links in the chain. Combat medics received training that far exceeded World War I standards. A World War II American medic completed 12 weeks of intensive medical training covering anatomy, physiology, wound treatment, shock management, infection control, medication administration, and battlefield first aid. They learned to work under fire, to make rapid triage decisions, and to provide care with whatever resources were available. Many medics performed medical procedures that would have been considered beyond their scope in civilian practice, but battlefield necessity and thorough training made them capable of providing life-saving care. The psychological impact on soldiers knowing this medical system existed behind them was substantial. Soldiers fought more aggressively when they knew that if wounded, they would receive rapid, competent medical care and had excellent chances of survival. This confidence translated into combat effectiveness. Units with good medical support suffered lower rates of combat fatigue and psychological breakdown because soldiers trusted that their military valued their lives and would make maximum effort to save them if wounded. German soldiers, by contrast, operated under constant awareness that if wounded, their survival depended heavily on luck, the tactical situation, allowing evacuation, and availability of medical supplies that were increasingly scarce as the war progressed. This knowledge contributed to deteriorating morale, increased surrender rates, and reluctance to take risks in combat. When German medical professionals encountered the American medical system, either as prisoners of war or through captured documents and interrogation of captured American medics, their reactions ranged from disbelief to professional envy. The scale, efficiency, and effectiveness of American battlefield medicine contradicted their understanding of what was possible under combat conditions. Dr. Klaus Werner's experience at Fort Meade was typical. Watching American military medicine operate at full efficiency, with ample supplies, modern equipment, trained staff, and seamless coordination between facilities, demonstrated capabilities that Werner had considered theoretically possible but logistically impossible to implement. The fact that Americans had not only implemented this system but sustained it across 2 oceans while simultaneously fighting wars in Europe and the Pacific indicated industrial and organizational capacity that Germany simply couldn't match. The statistical validation of American military medicine's effectiveness came from casualty data. Of American soldiers wounded in World War II who reached medical care alive, 96.5% survived, a survival rate unprecedented in military history. This meant that if a wounded American soldier was alive when medics reached him, he had better than 96% chance of surviving his wounds. For comparison, the survival rate in World War I had been 92%, and in the Civil War approximately 85%. Each percentage point represented thousands of lives saved. The time from wounding to surgery, a critical metric for survival, averaged 10 hours for American casualties in the European theatre and 8 hours in the Pacific. German casualties often waited days for surgery, when surgery was available at all. Japanese casualties frequently received no surgical care whatsoever, as Japanese military medicine operated with even more limited resources than German medicine. The speed of American medical response directly translated into saved lives. Air evacuation statistics illustrated the system's efficiency. By 1944, American air evacuation was moving over 20,000 casualties per month from combat theaters to rear area hospitals. The C-47 air ambulances, each capable of carrying 18 litter patients, flew continuously between field hospitals and evacuation hospitals, often making multiple trips per day. Critically wounded soldiers who, in previous wars, would have died during multi-day ground evacuations now reached advanced surgical care within hours, dramatically improving their survival chances. Hospital ships transported thousands of casualties from European and Pacific theaters back to the United States. These voyages, typically lasting 10 to 14 days, provided continuous medical care, including surgery, therapy, and rehabilitation during transit. Soldiers arrived at American hospitals already well along in their recovery process, ready for specialized treatment or return to duty, rather than requiring emergency intervention. The cost of this medical system was substantial. The United States spent approximately $2 billion on military medical services during World War II, including hospital construction, equipment, supplies, transportation, and personnel. This represented about 0.6% of total war spending. From a pure cost-benefit analysis, spending less than 1% of the war budget to achieve 96.5% survival rate for wounded soldiers was extraordinarily efficient. Each soldier saved could return to duty. Each soldier who survived rather than died represented continued training, investment, experience, and combat capability. German military medicine couldn't approach these expenditure levels. Germany spent approximately 400 million Reichsmarks on military medical services, roughly one-fifth of American spending, despite having comparable numbers of casualties to treat. This reflected Germany's overall industrial and resource limitations, not lack of medical knowledge or commitment to caring for wounded soldiers. German doctors and medics were competent professionals who would have implemented superior medical systems if given the resources. But resources were the constraint, and that constraint resulted in preventable deaths. The post-war impact of American World War II military medicine extended far beyond the war itself. The chain of evacuation concept, refined and proven in combat, became the foundation for modern civilian emergency medical services. The principle that critically ill or injured patients should receive continuous treatment while being transported to increasingly sophisticated care facilities is now standard practice in civilian medicine, directly descended from World War II military medical doctrine. Air ambulance services, now common for civilian emergencies, trace their origins to World War II air evacuation. The concept of using aircraft to rapidly transport critical patients to trauma centers began with C-47 air ambulances, moving wounded soldiers from field hospitals. Modern helicopter ambulances and fixed-wing air ambulances operate on the same principle, refined 80 years earlier. Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, MASH units, developed late in World War II and extensively used in the Korean War, emerged from the lesson that bringing surgery closer to the battlefield saved lives by reducing time to definitive care. These mobile hospitals could set up near front lines, perform complex surgery, and relocate as tactical situations changed. The MASH concept revolutionized forward battlefield medicine and remains in use today with modern variants. The training standards for combat medics, emphasizing comprehensive medical knowledge and ability to perform advanced procedures under primitive conditions, established benchmarks still used in training military medical personnel. Modern Army medics, Navy corpsmen, and Air Force pararescue specialists received training directly descended from World War II programs that proved ordinary soldiers could learn to provide sophisticated emergency medical care when properly trained. Dr. Klaus Werner, after his repatriation to Germany in 1946, worked in civilian medical practice in Munich. In a 1972 interview for a medical history journal, he reflected on his wartime experience. The American medical system I witnessed as a prisoner wasn't superior because American doctors were more skilled than German doctors. Medical knowledge was roughly equivalent. What differed was the system surrounding the doctors, the logistics that provided supplies, the transportation that moved patients, the industrial capacity that produced medications and equipment in unlimited quantities. American military medicine succeeded because America treated medical care as an industrial problem, requiring industrial solutions. They applied their extraordinary organizational and productive capacity to the medical mission, with the same intensity they applied to manufacturing aircraft and tanks. The result was a medical system that operated at a scale and efficiency that seemed impossible to those of us who had spent years working with inadequate supplies in overwhelmed facilities. I don't know how many German soldiers died from wounds that American military medicine could have saved. Thousands, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands. These weren't deaths from unsurvivable wounds or insufficient medical knowledge. They were deaths from insufficient resources, inadequate logistics, and inability to implement at scale what we knew theoretically how to do. That's the tragedy of war. Not just that soldiers die, but that some die unnecessarily because their military couldn't or wouldn't provide the resources to save them. After the war, I advocated strongly for West German civil defense planning to incorporate American-style emergency medical services. Rapid response, continuous care during transport, integration of hospital systems. These principles weren't just military innovations. They were broadly applicable to civilian medical emergencies. Modern ambulance services, emergency rooms, trauma centers, all reflect lessons learned from American World War II battlefield medicine. In that sense, the American medical system's impact extended far beyond saving soldiers' lives during the war. It permanently changed how societies respond to medical emergencies. This testimony from a former Wehrmacht medical officer validates American military medicine's revolutionary impact. The system shocked German professionals not through mysterious innovations, but through comprehensive application of known medical principles, supported by massive logistical systems that German industry couldn't match. The human stories behind this medical system illustrate its effectiveness. Sergeant William Bradford, 101st Airborne Division, was shot through the abdomen during the Battle of the Bulge on December 20th, 1944. A medic reached him within 2 minutes, applied sulfur powder to the wound, administered morphine, and began plasma transfusion for shock. Within 30 minutes, Bradford was at a battalion aid station, where a doctor performed emergency surgery to control internal bleeding. Within 4 hours, he was evacuated by air to an evacuation hospital in France, where surgeons performed definitive repair of his perforated intestines. Within 10 days, he was on a hospital ship bound for the United States. Within 6 weeks, he was recovering at an army hospital in Virginia. He survived a wound that in World War I would almost certainly have been fatal from infection or blood loss, saved by a medical system that moved him through multiple stages of increasingly sophisticated care while treating him continuously throughout the process. Lieutenant James Morrison, Navy pilot, was shot down over the Pacific on July 15, 1944. He bailed out wounded, with shrapnel in his leg and chest. A Navy destroyer recovered him within an hour. The ship's medical officer cleaned and bandaged his wounds, administered penicillin, and stabilized him for evacuation. Within 8 hours, a seaplane evacuated him to a base hospital on a rear area island. Within 48 hours, surgeons had removed the shrapnel, and he was recovering with no sign of infection. Within a month, he returned to flight duty. His survival and rapid recovery demonstrated the speed and efficiency of Pacific theater, medical evacuation, despite the enormous distances and logistical challenges. These individual survival stories, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers who received similar care, validated American military medicine's effectiveness. The system worked not occasionally or under ideal conditions, but consistently, day after day, treating casualties from minor wounds to life-threatening injuries with high survival rates and rapid recovery times. Today, the principles established by World War II American military medicine remain fundamental to how modern militaries and civilian emergency services provide medical care. The chain of evacuation, continuous treatment during transport, pre-positioning of medical supplies, rapid air evacuation, and integration of medical services into overall logistics planning all reflect lessons learned 80 years ago, when American military planners decided that battlefield medicine should operate as efficiently as ammunition supply or fuel distribution. The legacy of this approach is visible in modern combat casualty care. American soldiers wounded in recent conflicts have survival rates exceeding 98%, even higher than World War II, due to advances in trauma surgery, helicopter evacuation, and body armor. But the fundamental system: wounded soldier receives immediate care, moves through progressive stages of treatment, never experiences gaps in medical attention, remains identical to the system that shocked German doctors in 1945, when Dr. Klaus Werner watched American military medicine operate at Fort Meade and asked how it was possible to move wounded soldiers from European battlefields to American hospitals in days while maintaining their medical stability throughout the journey. He was witnessing the culmination of American industrial capacity applied to the medical mission. The answer to "how is this possible?" was simple in concept, but extraordinary in implementation. Treat battlefield medicine as a logistics problem. Provide unlimited resources to solve that problem. Train massive numbers of personnel to staff the system. And never accept that soldiers should die from survivable wounds when medical knowledge exists to save them. German military medicine operated under constraints that made implementing such a system impossible. Limited industrial capacity, chronic supply shortages, deteriorating transportation infrastructure, and overwhelming casualty volumes combined to create medical conditions where even skilled doctors couldn't save soldiers who should have survived. The gap between American and German battlefield medicine wasn't primarily medical knowledge. It was industrial capacity to produce supplies, transportation capacity to move casualties, and organizational capacity to coordinate complex systems across thousands of miles. That gap, measured in survival rates and recovery times, represented thousands of German soldiers who died from wounds that American military medicine could have saved. It represented American soldiers who survived and returned home because their military had built a medical system that prioritized saving lives with the same intensity it applied to destroying enemy forces. And it represented a revolution in military medicine that permanently changed how wars are fought, by demonstrating that wounded soldiers aren't inevitable losses, but recoverable assets worth investing maximum resources to save. The German doctors who encountered this system, whether as prisoners witnessing American medical facilities or through battlefield observations of American casualty handling, understood that they weren't seeing slightly better military medicine. They were seeing a fundamentally different approach where medicine had been industrialized, where logistics had been optimized, and where the preservation of wounded soldiers' lives had become a military priority supported by resources at scales that made success achievable. Their shock wasn't surprise that American doctors were more skilled. It was recognition that American military doctrine and industrial capacity had solved problems that German military medicine faced, but couldn't overcome due to resource limitations. The wounded soldiers who benefited from this system, both American casualties who survived wounds that would have killed them in previous wars, and even German prisoners who received better medical care in American custody than they would have received in German hospitals, were the ultimate validation. Medical systems should be judged by lives saved, and American World War II military medicine saved more lives, more quickly, under more difficult conditions than any military medical system in history. That achievement, built on logistics as much as medicine, on industrial capacity as much as medical knowledge, and on organizational excellence as much as individual doctor skill, remains the standard against which military medical systems are measured today.